If you share a creative idea, your partner might believe they inspired it, internalizing the credit as if it originated from them. In essence, they take credit for your success. But the main point, and I want to remind you, is in these narcissistic relationships, all these behaviors and demands are an unconscious attempt to feel less deficient or inferior, and perhaps they are also a reflection of malicious intent. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what it may feel like to be in a relationship with a narcissist. This topic has been on my mind recently because I was preparing to present a paper actually on narcissism. And that day that I was presenting, earlier in the morning, I decided to squeeze in a quick workout at the gym just to clear my head and get me ready for the big presentation. When I walked into the gym, an acquaintance recognized me and came over. Knowing I'm a competitive cyclist, he immediately launched into a story about bike racing. At first, it sounded like a mutual interest, so I politely listened. But as he continued, the story shifted to being all about him, who he knew, how he used to ride, the routes that he took, the miles that he logged, and how he always outperformed a friend he described as weaker. Meanwhile, time was ticking, and I was becoming increasingly restless. Normally, I'll chat between sets, keeping a balance between the conversation and the workout, but this time, I hadn't even started my workout. I glanced at the clock, feeling the tension between the pressure of my upcoming presentation and the guilt of wanting to cut the conversation. I put conversation in air quotes, by the way. I think you can understand why. But that I wanted to cut it short. The conversation wasn't really a conversation, obviously. There was no room for me in this exchange. No back and forth. No mutual engagement. There was more of a sense that I was just a silent witness to his monologue. It wasn't just a lack of interest. It felt like a complete disregard for my existence. Patients often describe feeling deflated, exhausted, and profoundly sad in these situations. They speak of being ignored, uncared for, and made to feel unimportant, controlled, and emotionally drained. These are just some of the common feelings that arise when dealing with someone like this. What I'm trying to capture here is something many of you already know. Feeling confused, frustrated, all alone, or depressed, or all well-documented feelings in narcissistic relationships. But I want to go a little deeper and look at these experiences from a psychodynamic perspective to help you understand what's happening beneath the surface so that you are in a better position to manage these kinds of interactions. In other words, understanding these painful emotions is a good first step. But have you ever wondered why these individuals, like my gym acquaintance, is so persistent in his need to dominate, not just the conversation, but the other person as well? In my review of the literature, there was something that I read that struck me, and I want to focus on this point. I read that the narcissist is so focused on themselves that they cannot really, and I quote, see their partner as, and this is the most important piece, a separate person. What does this actually mean? And what does this look like? They really can't, again, see their partner as separate. And how does this happen? How does it become so important to not see you as a separate person? In a seminal paper that I recently discussed in a course that I teach on narcissism, the question was raised, why must the narcissist defend against any recognition of separateness? To answer this, We must first understand that when one or both partners in a relationship struggle with narcissistic issues, they enter what renowned psychoanalyst Herbert Rosenfeld describes as a narcissistic object relationship. I know that this is a complicated concept, so let me break it down. This concept refers to a type of connection where one or both partners struggle to see the other as a separate, autonomous person. In such a relationship, defenses against recognizing separateness between oneself and the partner play a predominant role. In Rosenfeld's theory, when he talks about defenses against recognizing separateness between the self and others, he's referring to a deep-rooted difficulty or even refusal to acknowledge the distinction between oneself and others. This concept is crucial in understanding certain forms of narcissistic relationships, where the person fails to fully recognize or accept the separateness and autonomy of other people. The narcissist experiences a deep need to merge with others as a way to maintain an illusion of wholeness and omnipotence. Recognizing the separateness and autonomy of others threatens them because they may see something like the value of the other person, or the other person can easily give to others. The other person can have fun, enjoy relationships, and is comfortable being relaxed or vulnerable. They don't want to see that. So all of this introduces, when they see these things, painful feelings that must get wiped away. What better way to rid oneself of these painful feelings that exist around someone being different than to not recognize that they're different, to not allow for difference? Now, you might be wondering, what does this actually look like in real life? Imagine a couple where the guy values going to bed early, waking up at dawn, and avoiding late night TV. Now here, you could plug in any similar situation where one person in a relationship values something, I don't know, perhaps smoking weed and playing video games. But the main point is one partner values something, right? And the partner has a different set of values. That's the other partner. So the two partners have different values. In this example, let's say his wife, on the other hand, enjoys staying up late and sleeping in. This difference frustrates him, and he starts talking to her and questioning her about why does she not wake up early. He presents how nice it would be if she would wake up with him in the morning, and while he gets some work done, she prepares breakfast for him and the kids. Having this wish is completely appropriate, but if or once he starts pressuring her to change her sleep schedule, he is no longer managing it symbolically. In other words, he's no longer managing the wish. It's not just a wish, through thoughts and fantasies of a wife who mirrors his own habits. Instead, when he pressures her, he begins concretely acting on his wish, trying to control his partner and erase any sense of her separate identity and preferences, just like what happened with me. To borrow from psychoanalytic theory, we refer to this as the object being omnipotently incorporated. What does this question even mean? One way Rosenfeld describes defending against separateness is through what he calls omnipotent incorporation of the other person. Essentially, this means that the narcissist unconsciously attempts to absorb, take over, control, or merge with other people, denying their individuality. Instead of recognizing the other person as a separate individual with their own thoughts and feelings, again, like me at the gym, and the wife wanting her own sleep schedule, the narcissist views them as an extension of their own needs and identity. This illusion of merging, taking over the other person, right, gives the narcissist a sense of control and power. Let me say that in a different way. When defending against separation, the other person is omnipotently incorporated, and the self becomes so identified with the incorporated other person that all separate identity or any boundary between self and the other person is completely denied. You may hear phrases like this. This is just to illustrate that because it's a little abstract. We're the family that does this, or we're the couple who goes to sleep early, right? And wakes up early. In other words, we are the same. Or, in my gym experience, this fellow pays no attention to my interest. He just talks at me with no regard for my time or even my existence. He omnipotently incorporates me. In other words, he controls, he takes over and attempts to take over my whole experience. Remember, I don't exist in this conversation. What helped me survive this experience is keeping in mind that for this gym acquaintance, his grandiose sense of self, his grandiose behavior might be his way of coping with his own feelings of emptiness, inferiority, or shame. Many of us, unfortunately, get tangled up in these exchanges. For example, with that couple that I just mentioned, she became quite angry when her husband spoke to her about changing her sleep schedule. He then got angry at her, and this led to an intense conflict, and subsequently, she withdrew from him. With that in mind, you may now be asking, how do you navigate these intense moments without escalating the conflict or shutting down emotionally? Let's try to understand this by continuing our example with the guy wanting his wife on his sleep schedule. Imagine this guy feels a deep sense of inferiority. I don't know, he might have always struggled with feelings of not being good enough, stemming from early experiences where he felt constantly compared to a sibling who was seen as the golden child. He gets in a relationship with his wife, who's confident and seems comfortable with herself and decisions. He feels a mixture of admiration, but also envy towards her. This envy, however, and by the way, it's envy because she has something. She possesses something that he does not have, but that he wants. So this envy isn't simply about wishing he had her qualities. Yes, this can be the quality of sleeping in. Even though this guy wakes up early and values going to sleep early, that doesn't mean he doesn't admire or want this quality, like this more carefree, not being so driven to the point of anxiety, right? But this is tied to a deeper sense of inferiority and shame that he carries within himself. So in other words, instead of openly acknowledging these feelings of envy or admiration, right, that he wants something that his wife has, that he admires, in other words, that she could be carefree, he might attempt to, again, this word incorporate, I put that in quotes, which just means take over. So he starts to take over. And this could happen in a few ways. One of which is to expect her to imitate and mirror, as I demonstrated earlier, his own habits and behaviors. What he would get, however, isn't genuine admiration or aspiration from her. He is merely attempting to possess and turn her into a carbon copy of himself. In his mind, this is a way to shore up his own fragile self-image. Let's take this one step further. If he in fact harbors a hidden resentment towards her, it may manifest in subtle all the way to overt criticisms and demands. In other words, it's on a spectrum in terms of how it manifests. This is the destructive element that Rosenfeld talks about with envy. There's a simultaneous desire to possess and destroy the envied object. I would like to clarify something. It is commonly known that many narcissists become controlling. They see their significant others more like property than a person, And they don't consider that they have their own wants, their own needs, their own desires. For example, the narcissist may become angry if you're late for a dinner date. They might get into a bad mood when you go out with friends, or they accuse you of being miserable if you're not always happy and glowingly positive in their presence. I wonder if any of this sounds familiar. At a more extreme level of disturbance of incorporation, remember that's taking over the other person, they may even try to isolate you from significant others and persuade you, for instance, to give up your job or a close relationship, right? Maybe with a girlfriend. At this more extreme level, it is no longer a fantasy like I described earlier, which I said was appropriate, to have a wish that my wife is on the same schedule as me. This husband does not just hope now at this more extreme level or wish that his wife would just be like him. No, at this level, his wish now becomes actualized and literal as he starts to demand that she follow his sleep schedule, or else you could fill in the blank there. The act of possessing plays out in other ways that may be familiar to you. If you share a creative idea, your partner might believe they inspired it, internalizing the credit as if it originated from them. In essence, they take credit for your success. But the main point, and I want to remind you, is in these narcissistic relationships, all these behaviors and demands are an unconscious attempt to feel less deficient or inferior, and perhaps they are also a reflection of malicious intent. When there's malicious intent, this represents the darkest layer of narcissistic relationships. Rosenfeld discusses how incorporation enables an extreme enjoyment of sadistic power and control. Once someone is incorporated, again, taken over, the underlying shame and envy do not vanish. In other words, the person who's taking you over still feels this envy. So these feelings transform into a need to maintain dominance within the relationship. See, now we have sort of a chronic, ongoing struggle, power struggle for control or domination over you in the relationship. This manifests as taking pleasure in diminishing or sabotaging the other person, helping to preserve their own fragile sense of self. This sadistic pleasure often leads to emotional manipulation for control, particularly when the narcissist senses the other person pulling away or asserting their independence. Remember what happened when she asserted that she would not change her sleep routine? The conflict escalated. And this is an important thing to keep in mind, because when we start thinking about interventions, we now know that separateness is the problem. Separation is the problem. And when you assert your own separateness with a no, that's going to escalate things. Anyway, this leads to our next and final question. If you can't push back, if you can't assert yourself, if you can't assert your own autonomy in this kind of relationship, what should you do when someone is attempting to, and I quote, incorporate, right? Again, control or possess you, when they're trying to take over? What are some of the things a person can do if you find yourself in a narcissistic relationship? If the feelings and examples discussed resonate with you or someone you know, it's crucial to recognize that your emotional experiences in relationships with narcissistically disturbed individuals are valid and shared by many. While I can't tell you exactly what you should do, I can share tools and techniques that are not only empirically validated, but have also proven effective in my own practice. Let's revisit the first example that I shared with you, the gym. right? The gym scenario with the acquaintance who was attempting to use me to bolster his own sense of self. Once I understood what he was doing, that he was seeking to incorporate, if I could borrow that word again, or possess me to avoid his own feelings of separation, insignificance, inferior, who knows what. See, we don't know what, right? Because that's the whole point of this, so that they don't have these feelings. But anyway, I was able to create some space by giving him a little of what he was looking for. So in other words, if I think that separation is the problem and they're looking for a merged experience, I'm going to give him some of that. So I acknowledged his enthusiasm and I validated his experience, saying something like this: "Wow, that's great. It sounds like beating your friend on the bike was a big win for you." Then I gently redirected the conversation to my own needs by saying, "That reminds me of how fit I want to get. I want to get that fit too, so I really need to start my own workout." See, then I pivot. Now, I could imagine that as you're listening to this, some of you may feel like, "Oh, I'm not going to say something like that. That's like giving in to them." But it's not giving in is an emotional experience. Like, in other words, if you don't feel like you're giving in, you're not giving in. Like, I didn't feel like I was giving in because I understood what this fellow needed. And this allowed me to shift the dynamic without triggering his defensiveness or making him feel dismissed. What tends to work best in these situations, in my experience, and again, this has been proven to be effective, is to initially take an empathic stance by acknowledging the person's need. For example, you might say, "Thanks for sharing that with me. It sounds really interesting." But then introduce a new direction by expressing your own needs or boundaries, such as, "But unfortunately, I need to get to work now," right? Or something like that. I'm making this up, but I think you get the sense of first validation before pivoting. Because this approach maintains a balance between the validating and establishing your own autonomy, preventing the interaction from becoming a merged experience of you just supporting their self-esteem. And by the way, that would be giving in to them. With this individual, I was able to stay close to his experience, to acknowledge and appreciate his grandiosity without forcing an abrupt separation between us. Abruptly dismissing or confronting someone with a grandiose sense of self often leads to what? Defensiveness or feelings of rejection, which then escalate. And then it's like the example I gave earlier. There's no meaningful dialogue. It leads to one person shutting down or walking away. So the aim is to meet them where they are and then gently guide the interaction towards a mutual understanding. And this technique is equally relevant for personal relationships as well. Let's return to the situation with the couple I described. How might she respond to his request, which may not actually rise to a demand, let's say, to wake up on his schedule? To continue an empathic stance while being mindful of his attempts to control or possess her. And right, that he's not just trying to control her, but he's also terrified of separation. See, and that's really important to keep in mind. It's not just about you are being controlled, which is part of it, but it's also that this person is struggling with allowing you to have an existence of your own. So in this example, she could respond in a way that acknowledges his perspective without fully submitting to it. And again, I'm just making this up. You could fill in the blank here, but here's one possible response. But if you have something in mind that has been successful, let us know. She could say something like, "I could see that waking up early is really important to you. And it's great that you have such a disciplined routine. I need to make sure I get enough rest so I could take care of the kids and my responsibilities during the day. But I'd be happy to figure out other ways that I could support you." This response reflects an understanding of his values. In other words, that he's disciplined and he has a routine. while gently asserting her own need for rest. It subtly acknowledges what is important to him without fully agreeing to his suggestion. She also reasserts her own needs. You heard that, right? Sleep. And suggests an alternative that doesn't reinforce his controlling behavior. By doing this, she creates space. See, that's the critical point. Creating space. And if you've listened to any of my prior episodes, I talk about this quite frequently, not getting entrapped in these interactions. Sometimes I even suggested playful ways to do this with the grandiose sense of self. But the goal is to create some space for both perspectives, right? Without triggering his defensiveness or escalating the conflict. See, in other words, oftentimes what I see is since there's no space, the space collapses. And then this woman, for instance, needs to really assert herself, right? So she feels heard. The main point that I'm trying to make is about creating a safe space for honest dialogue, gradually fostering an environment where you both can feel heard. Both of you feel heard. Not just he wants something and then she's going to counter it with, no, I'm not doing that. See, nobody's being heard in that moment. If this seems strange to you or too challenging, therapy can also be an invaluable resource in this process, helping you to unpack your feelings and develop strategies to exist in or even redefine the relationship in a healthier way. Okay, let's start wrapping things up. In narcissistic relationship, there's a recurring theme of feeling unheard, unimportant, or emotionally drained. The underlying issue is often the narcissist's struggle to recognize their partner as a separate person, leading to one-sided dynamics where the focus is entirely on them. I hope I helped you understand that narcissists defend against recognizing separateness through merging or omnipotent incorporation. That's what we called it, but I broke that down. That just means that they're taking over your experience. And in the more extreme cases, they're taking over your life. Armed now with a deeper understanding of how and why they attempt to possess others, I hope you're in a better position to relate to someone like this in your life. As always, I encourage you to reach out with any questions or comments regarding anything that I covered today. Look, I know that these concepts and even this perspective perhaps is a bit complicated. And like I said earlier, it may sound a little bit strange, but I felt it was really important to talk about this directly and to give you a deeper understanding of why someone tries to dominate and control. The control is the manifest problem. What I'm trying to do is show you what's going on beneath the surface. If you want to learn more about narcissistic characteristics, please take a moment to subscribe to this podcast. If you want to do an even deeper dive into narcissistic dynamics, I'm very pleased to announce that I just released a continuing education seminar series on all topics related to narcissism. There I go into far more detail, and you could find that as well as many other resources. They can all be accessed through my website, which is linked below. Okay, until next time, engage your mind and not your omnipotent need to possess and control. All right, bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Dakota podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.